Welcome to Chapter 2, Mediated Interpersonal Communication. This chapter is adopted from the 15th edition. If you do not have the 15th edition, I will do my best to provide as much information available for this chapter. In this chapter, we'll review the pros and cons of mediated communication, mediated interpersonal versus mass personal communication, and the importance of competence in mediated communication. Briefly reviewing the learning objectives we hope to accomplish by the end of this presentation, the drawbacks of mediated communication and the benefits. You will be able to distinguish between mediated interpersonal and mass personal communication and the use of each appropriately, and begin to apply the principles of competence to your mediated interpersonal and mass personal communication. For most of history, face-to-face communication was the foundation of our interpersonal communication. Today, we find that it's very important for us to maintain that face-to-face, but also understanding that proximity is a very important part of most of our relationships. Technology can overcome and bring limitations in ways that we communicate. Today, we use our laptops, our phones, we chat across the world. Everything's done online. How many times have you texted, posted, or messaged someone just in the last 48 hours? These are forms of mediated communication, blogging, emails, tweets, etc. Social media are a subset within the categories of websites, applications, networking, and sharing content. In this content, we have Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Those are just some social media platforms. Email and texting are also considered mediated communication channels, not as social because they don't involve networking and content sharing. So in this section, we're going to look at how mediated communication works within your own relationships. So what are some of those pros and cons? We know that history has brought some predictions related to communication. And through history, we've also incorporated technologies. 2,500 years ago, Socrates declared that writing was inferior to speech. And he warned us that a written record will create forgetfulness in learners, in our learners' souls, because they will not use their memories. So there were warnings about recording this information. Well, today we hear about Twitter, the constant diffusion of statements, comments, opinions, etc. Could it hurt your brain? Could it benefit you? So today, these worries about commonplace technologies sound kind of comical, but they are concerns. There's concerns that arise with every innovation that we're exposed to. But fortunately for us, scholarships continue to research and investigate what the true cost and benefits are of using these forms of communication technology. So one of the most important debates regarding mediated communication is, does it alienate or does it connect? Does it bring people together or does it create a distance? Let's look at that in the next slide. In chapter 1, we reviewed some brief topics about loneliness and how it creates a threat to our own health. Also, excessive media use and loneliness can go hand in hand, according to Hunt et al. 2018. Technology can be alienated when it substitutes face-to-face interaction or communication. So there is a correlation between loneliness and what social scientists call preference for online social interaction. That's preference for online social interaction, Chen 2019. Many people rely on the online interaction because they don't have to respond in real time. They don't have to manage the complexities that come with the transactional communication model, where we're sending messages and we're communicating simultaneously, not having to interpret nonverbal cues or be responsible for those cues. So frequent users of social media might become accustomed to this interaction and get caught up in a vicious cycle of alienation. Because they have a preference for online interaction, it can lead to withdrawal from meaningful offline interactions. So often they don't even realize that they're separating themselves and they start to feel isolated. It's a negative spiral that can create problems in offline relationships, at school, at work, withdraw more from in-person interactions. It's hard to say whether loneliness leads to a preference for online social interaction or vice versa. Researchers have found that either way, the problem is potentially serious. Let's take a look at this video in the next slide.
Driving with a box stuck under his car. And like, who knows how long he was driving? I saw him pull out of the parking lot and turn right, and the box is still stuck under his car. So who knows how long he was driving with that box under his car? I like bet he got home, he pulled into his driveway.
Out in the sky. I'm not. Wow. Like, this is not. It's not.
I don't think it's real. I don't think it's real.
I see the lineup for cars. I don't like this. The Empire State Building is really close to it, so it's a good.
Consider the following. How do you feel when you're together, but alone on your phone, or when someone else is on their phone? Why do you perceive that people want to be together, but then permit them to be distracted by their phones? Have you found a way to comfortably address this with others, or are you comfortable with isolating with your phone? Give it some thought. This topic causes us to be challenged by so many important factors. Mediated communication helps families stay in touch. Think about right now as we're going through this pandemic. Those of us that are separated geographically, or even just down the block, but we can't see each other. Technology helps us stay connected. Steve Jobs, who found Apple Inc., he suggests that personal computers be renamed to interpersonal computers. Research has shown that mediated communication can enhance relationships, but it may not contradict the alienating factors that are described in your text. So mediated communication isn't a replacement for face-to-face, as it should be a supplement. Mediated communication helps you stay in touch with friends and family members, coworkers, who might be outside of your social orbit, if you will, or your social access. Texting has given an increase in the sense of connection. Social networking can make it possible to connect with old contacts. We've seen that over and over again. I hear those stories all the time. And just yesterday, I heard a story about someone who, I think in the early 90s, had had a break in their friendship. And because of social media, all these years later, they were able to reconnect and open the door to building their relationship again. So there's some value to this digital communication. Connecting digitally has transformed how we're communicating in the world today. And with this pandemic, it's been a life-saving tool for us. It's been a lifeline for us. So think about older generations who aren't familiar with the use of social media and video connecting and trying to bridge this gap. So we need to find a balance, be considerate, those that are tech savvy, and consider understanding the pros and cons, because it does help maintain our relationships. It can make it easier to create new ones. 2/3 of teens today have made new friends online, according to Lenhart 2016. Many people who engage in online groups or gaming systems find themselves making friends with other users. Makes me think about a crochet club that I'm involved with. Yes, crocheting. You can make some amazing things with crocheting. But I'm actually connected with the group on the East Coast. The women are from New Jersey and New York City. And it's rather fascinating to have that intercultural exchange on a craft topic. So it's pretty wonderful. So this mediated communication has revolutionized our world, not only just interpersonally, but when you think about dating, finding partners, so many take advantage of online dating services today. More than 1/3 of 19,000 married respondents to a survey said that they met their partners online. Couples who meet online stay together about as much as people that meet in person. Mediated channels are vital to sustaining connections in many relationships. But we need to find the balance. We need to find a balance so that those connections are meaningful and not superficial. As we can't discuss live what these considerations are of alienation or connection, I want you to think about the alienated factors that I mentioned and the connecting factors. Is there an alternative viewpoint? What are some of your experiences? How does mediation play an important role in your social interaction? Just take a moment to think about it. Some users might dispute the view that relationships that are created or sustained only through social media might be superficial. Can mediated communication contribute to meaningful relationships? What do you think is true? Social scientists have argued that it's possible to sustain about 150 relationships at a time. That's according to Dunbar 2018. Dunbar's number is in recognition of the Oxford University anthropologists who established this. If you're lucky, you have an inner circle of about 5 core people, and then you have an additional layer of 10 to 15 close friends. Beyond that, the circle is roughly 35 or so strong contacts. Does that sound about right for yours? So what about the 100 people outside of this estimate of 150? What about the 100 or more people of those meaningful connections? You don't have the time or energy to actually sustain those. When we think about our followers, we can have hundreds of them, thousands even, right? But are those actually relationships that are actively sustained? Dunbar's number is smaller than the number of friends many people claim on social networking sites. There's a study that compared the online exchange of people with thousands of social media friends to those who identified smaller numbers of online relationships. The conclusion found that regardless of how many online friend users claimed, they only actively maintained relationships with the same number of people, roughly about 15. So you may have a large number of acquaintances online, but it's a stretch to consider them your close friends. Scholars have suggested that seeking an unrealistically large number of social media friends might be compensation for a low self-esteem. That's according to Lee et al. 2012. What do you think about that? So an over-reliance can lead to superficial connections. Face-to-face conversations provide forms of connections that can be achieved online. Nee and Ebring found that email is a way to stay in touch, but you can't share a coffee or a beer with somebody on email, and much less give them a hug. They did a study, Flanagan, in 2005, of college students who used text messaging. Nothing appeared to compare to face-to-face communication in terms of their satisfying individuals. So communication, information, and social needs are important to our connections. So let's consider mediated communication can make things seem superficial. Does it mean anything at all? Do online connections have value? Well, through communication technologies, we can connect with like-minded people that have similar interests. We can establish virtual communities. I mentioned that I belong to a virtual crochet group. A few of us are here in Southern California, and most of them are on the East Coast. And they were strangers when we first met. So whether you follow particular groups, there's these exchanges with strangers that lead to very valuable relationships, as in my example. But we see this with sports, we see this with areas of any interest. So mediated communication can strengthen existing relationships. Dainton and Myers 2020 believe that it supplements face-to-face interactions. The theory of media multiplexity, it asserts that people enhance their close relationships by using a greater number of channels. Ledbetter 2015. The stronger the bond, the more mediated channels you'll likely use in a relationship. Boaz et al. 2016. So we have found that our researchers have extensively looked at how mediated communication can strengthen our existing relationships. Even the relatively superficial communication can enhance some important relationships. Research has been done by Boyle and Sullivan 2016, reporting that dating couples that texted one another throughout the day started to build some intimacy. Even if their conversations were just routine and mundane, but that built connections and intimacy. So social networking sites also give family, friends, close friends the chance to keep up with each other. Just checking in, how did your day go? So even these brief streaks of like Snapchat, exchanges that help maintain relationships according to Stein 2017, bring in some intimacy. So mediated communication facilitates meaningful relationships by building what's known as a social capital, access to people and resources that enable social success, Williams 2019. So staying in touch with someone from the past or current, that can lead to maybe staying in touch with a former boss, that can lead to an important recommendation on an upcoming job that you're interested in. So we find that these connections are important. Scholars use a term called weak ties, and these weak ties are used to describe less personal relationships, those infrequent communication. Even though weak sounds negative, these ties can offer strong rewards. Networking with contacts beyond your inner circle can be useful for jobs. Just staying connected with these weak ties, the more weak ties you have, or fellow members, the happier you might feel. Research by Rainey and Wellman 2012. So critics do argue that digital communication is downright unhealthy. Others respond by pointing out how connecting electronically can actually improve health. So are these claims valid? So there's some unhealthy aspects in this mediated communication. So there's an overuse, can take a toll on physical and mental health. Woods and Scott found that too much online time can lead to sleep deprivation. I think many of us listening can relate to that. Smartphone users often stay up late checking their devices, staying caught up. They don't want to miss out on things. So people take time off from social media. People that take time off from social media have actually reported to have better moods more consistently and to feel happier with more face-to-face interaction. So there is a link between heavy reliance on mediated communications and conditions that involve depression. This appears true for teenage girls, a research done by Twinge 2018. So social media also was used to associated with a diminished self-esteem. So these profiles paint an unrealistic positive portrait. So it's easy to understand why viewers who take them at face value can feel inferior by comparison. And when we think about our own identities, we can get caught up in this trap. So as we think about the successful people and how we follow them and look at them, critics have challenged the cause and effect between relationships and the lack of well-being. There was a study who followed social media users for years, done by Heffer et al. In 2019. And they found that adolescent girls' depression led to social media use. Depression leads to social media use rather than vice versa. So this implies that an obsession with technology use might be a symptom rather than a cause of mental health. There's a strong argument for carefully monitoring smartphone use and mental health. So the dark side of communication details some sobering conclusions about the relationship between smartphone use and mental health issues. So I think it's important that we maintain this rigorous analysis as we go through and begin to try to understand, are we being balanced in our use of social media? A research that was done by Steger and Lewitz in 2018, a week without using social media. How long could you last without access to social media? What effect would it have on your disposition and your social life? So the participants in a study, they were instructed not to use their social media for 7 days. Could you do that? Apps were installed on their smartphones to monitor their online behavior. The researchers also checked in with the participants each day to see how they were doing. To no one's surprise, most of the participants exhibited withdrawal symptoms, such as craving and boredom. A substantial number, 59% of the participants, broke down and used social media at least once. Participants also said they felt social pressure from their peers to return to social media. This study offered scientific support for what most users already know. Communicating with others via social media is a basic part of most people's daily lives. The challenge is how to use social media to enhance personal well-being and relational success. So 59% of the participants were unable to get through without checking in that 7-day period. So part of their detox was very challenging. It was very hard for them not to connect, not to mention the peer pressure. Why don't you try a detox? Try it for 48 hours, or maybe 12 hours is all you can do. How did you feel in that short time? Take note of that. This would be something great to share in your final project that'll be due in May. You can share in your presentation what your detox experience was like. A thought to consider. Earlier we mentioned about weak ties. Just want to remind you that as we consider our detox, we know that these weak ties can really enhance our careers, keeping connected with former employers, former bosses, like through LinkedIn. If you haven't set up a professional profile, you should start looking at considering setting something up for yourself. As you begin to become competent communicators, think about your career. Think about the fields that you want to be involved with. A great recommendation by the authors of your book. While we're not discussing online, but I'd like you to challenge yourself. Again, some good pointers for that final presentation that'll be due in May. Go through your recent text messages. What do you notice? What are you finding out about yourself? Have you taken the time to go through and look at how you're communicating? Would you change something? Is it a conversation maybe you should have tried to connect face to face, or over the phone, or through a video conversation where you could see each other? Some thoughts to consider. We have discussed earlier some of the points here. It has its pros and cons. Communication technology has been good for us through this pandemic. Can it improve health? What do you think? Take a look at your own interactions and begin to assess, how has it been good for you? Do you get into an overload space where you just need to take a step back, put your phone down, and read a book for a day or two? You'll need to decide. And if you're responsible for minors, help them understand what they're doing. It's a real challenge because younger generations, they rely on this mediated communication. It's how they've learned to communicate. Some babies, they get a tablet as early as 8 months, or a phone. The babies want to play on the phones, right? They're great babysitters. But what impact is that having? And how are you going to establish some boundaries so that healthy communication is developed? All right, so here's the bottom line. Does mediated communication bring people together or separate them? Does it foster meaningful relationships or make it more superficial? Does it enhance or reduce mental health? Everything in moderation is healthy. So we need to find that balance. Not too much or too little. We have to find that balance. So underusing mediated communication can affect relationships. If I don't use my mediated communication, it's not as easy for me to communicate with family in other countries. Are you active or are you passive? How are you using this? Are you just passive, like you're scrolling through information so quickly and pressing like, and not really engaging? So consider how you're engaging. Are you being active? Are you being thoughtful? Are you applying some interpersonal techniques to that mediated communication? Social media users who interact with those that they know offline appear to fare better when it comes to topics of depression. Phone calls and texting are positively correlated with well-being. There are some ill effects that come from mediated channels that we have to be careful about. As research continues, we're going to continue to explore, how does it impact sleep deprivation? Is it increasing depression, loneliness, social anxiety, or is it helping in some ways? Is it diminishing self-esteem, or can we guide the use of social media or mediated communication to develop self-esteem? Is it decreasing our well-being? Are we looking at our phones every 2 seconds? Can we keep it in our pockets? Can we keep it locked in our backpacks? Or do you have to constantly keep looking at it? What's most important, students, is that you take a moment and review and evaluate what your habits are. I mentioned the bottom line earlier. So consider, how are you using your social media? How are the people that you're responsible for using social media? Are you helping them? Are you guiding them? Are you active Or are you passive? Are you just being passive, scrolling through and liking everything? What about communicators that are familiar to you? Take a moment to think about the users that you interact with and those that you know offline. Which relationships are better? Maybe some of those relationships include both, but take the time to think about it. Again, how are you using social media? What is the amount of social media that you use? Most of our phones tell us how long we've been online. Do you ever pay attention to it? Have you thought about when you see 7 hours of your 24 hours is spent online? What are you doing in those 7 hours? Some of us read. I like to do a lot of my research online, so I don't feel so guilty if I get a 7-hour day. It really depends on what I'm working on. Sometimes I'm really shocked and I feel like I've been very passive and I haven't gotten my tasks done. Just stop and think about what social media, what mediated communication is doing in your personal, interpersonal communication. In this diagram, we're looking at examples of mass, mediated interpersonal, and mass personal communication. So we can take a look at, on the far right, personal, on the far bottom right, are personal interactions. So through mass communication, interpersonal communication. Over to the left, we see more impersonal. So it's showing us both sides of the spectrum here. The boundaries between these categories can be a little bit cloudy. The term mass personal communication characterizes how individuals use mediated communication to reach audiences. So it shows how social media and other mass channels can be used for personal communication. Interpersonal and mass personal communication involve personal content. Your mass personal updates might range from superficial, I got all the classes I hoped for, to deeply significant. I just learned that my beloved grandmother entered into hospice. I don't know how I'll get along without her love and support. So either way, a mass personal message is about you and it's personal. There are message boards that are good examples of how mass and interpersonal communication combine their messages. There's elements of mass communication because they're available to a larger audience, considering a post you may put out there. But they also have a personal dimension. Regulars may call each other by names and disclose details, even though they've never met in person. So using mediated communication to reach masses, you're reaching a large audience. So mass communication is a useful way to keep your extended networks informed about your life events. Say, for instance, Instagram or Facebook. So we can share with a large group of people, sharing mass personal updates. Scanning our newsfeed for updates from friends and family is an easy and powerful tool for maintaining these relationships. How much more difficult would it be to keep in touch with everyone if we didn't have social media? So they have the potential to reach a large audience, greater than we could imagine by picking up the phone and making 50 phone calls. Most people are aware that 25% of their social media audience is actually engaged. Bernstein 2013 found that it's unlikely that most of the TikTok posters who have several million followers ever imagined that their videos would reach such a large group of people. According to Sun et al., even with the more modest online presence, it may be that some viewers are lurkers who like to follow you without creating any interaction. So there's possibility that your immediate followers might repost your messages or use them in their own networks. Having a larger audience can be gratifying today, but it can also be humiliating. So mass personal content does carry a level of obligation, but it doesn't carry the same level of obligation that you would expect when you're sending or receiving a private message. So think about the news feeds that you follow. You don't want to respond to every post. And those posts really weren't directed specifically for you. When you're the one that's broadcasting information, you may have an imagined audience in mind. But what if some of your followers didn't happen to see your message? So the frequency and nature of your messages will influence the level of response. It's unrealistic to expect your followers to reach out approving after seeing a photo, etc. But on the other hand, according to French and Bizarrova 2017, many mass personal messages call for some kind of response. And often when we post something, we go back and we're looking for that acknowledgement. So you would probably feel unappreciated if you did not get the reactions to your posts that you may be looking for. Even with less momentous news, users can develop a response threshold or a desired reaction size. Likes and other brief reactions are often sufficient. I know for myself, when somebody I know posts something and I have a knee-jerk reaction to post a comment, if I see they have a certain amount of comments, let's say 20, sometimes even 15, I don't add a comment. But if there's only one or two, I may consider adding my comment. As you're using your mass personal messages, I'm sure you're already aware that there's risks involved. Think about what you're posting. Does it strengthen your relationships? Do you want to build support? Or do you just want to put it out there? Maybe you have an intention of stirring things up. But what's most important is that you have control of what you're posting. Let's review, what does it mean to use the like button? When you hit the like button on someone's post, do you think it has some meaning? The answer might be more complicated than you might think. A research team led by Aaron Sumner investigated the various meanings of like. For example, Facebook. A survey of active users generated a variety of responses. Communication has both content and relational dimensions, as mentioned in Chapter 1. The same is true for the like button. It's on a content level. Users hit like to say, I agree with your post, or I found it amusing. On a relational level, it can mean I support you or appreciate you. So on a content level, users hit like to communicate they agree with your post or found that it was amusing. On a relational level, I support you, I appreciate you, or even I'm sorry. As one respondent noted about liking a downbeat message, I didn't mean that I liked that sad post, I mean that I supported her. Do you ever find yourself selecting like, but then thinking, that's not appropriate, we need something else there? So digging deeper in this research done by Aaron Sumner, users said that like serve a variety of communicative functions. For instance, it's a simple way to maintain weak tie relationships. We mentioned that earlier. As one user noted, it's more socially acceptable to like a post from someone you don't know than to comment. A like also makes a statement about the person hitting the button. It can signal an agreement and alignment with a political or social argument, which is reason to be cautious about liking controversial posts. We've heard of so many, or you might have had some controversial arguments with your own friends and family. Equivalent to a head nod, people use like to acknowledge having seen or read a post. So think about that like and a head nod when you're face to face. There's a baseline expectation from these close friends of yours, right? Have you ever talked about it? Brandwatch.com estimates that Facebook users around the world generate 4 million likes per minute. 4 million likes. This study showed that the meaning of those likes are wide and varied. They serve a host of communicative purposes. They're also ambiguous. Ambiguity tells us, is this content or is it relational? We're not sure. You can act in a pro-social way while still leaving room for interpretation. Ambiguity, it's not clear. Why do you like? One of our primary goals is to become a competent communicator in this class. Effective mediated communication requires that we understand competence, and we talked a little bit about competence in chapter 1. Is what we're saying suited for the situation? Are we considering the channel? Should we be texting, video chatting, emailing, using face-to-face? When we think about the transactional communication model, these are important questions to ask ourselves. Which one is best? But we also need to consider the message and how we're sending that message through the choices that we're making. Richness describes the abundance of nonverbal cues that add clarity to our message. Leanness describes messages that carry less information due to the lack of nonverbal cues. So let me repeat that. Richness describes the abundance of nonverbal cues that add clarity to a verbal message. Leanness describes messages that carry less information due to lack of nonverbal cues. When we get to the chapter on nonverbal messages, we'll learn more about how nonverbal messages play an important role in our communication. But by comparison, most mediated channels are considered leaner. There are times when our lean message is the best route to take. Maybe you don't want the receiver to hear a quiver in your voice or see the sweat on your forehead. So leanness in social media presents an opportunity, but it also can present some issues. Hyperpersonal communication accelerates the discussion of personal topics and relational development beyond what normally happens in a face-to-face interaction. According to Jiang, 2011, online communicators self-disclose at higher rates and share more emotions than they would in person, often leading to a premature sense of relational intimacy. This accelerated disclosure may explain why communicators who meet online sometimes have difficulty shifting to a face-to-face interaction. Hyperpersonal communication accelerates the discussion of personal topics and relational development beyond what normally happens in a face-to-face interaction. The diagram or table in this slide will demonstrate how mediated channels are leaner. So as you move from in-person to text, you can see that it's a leaner interaction, where if you move from text to in-person, it's a richer interaction. Are there benefits to an asynchronous message? What is an asynchronous message? Asynchronous communication occurs when there's a lag between receiving and responding. For example, a voice message is asynchronous. So are tweets. Maybe a text might be. Whereas synchronous is an in-person conversation. It could be an online chat, but more like a video chat, so we're seeing more face-to-face. If you're engaged in a chat, it may be somewhat synchronous, but the asynchronous is mediated messages that are different from the face-to-face. So an asynchronous message gives you the choice of responding or not. You can ignore it or wait to respond until later. Asynchronous communication can be useful when there's a lot of emotions taking place. They're also a good way to approach a transgression, an apology if something's been violated. You can take time to think about the right words to say. Mediated communication is permanent. Most of it is. When we think about chapter 1, what were some of those points that we mentioned about the uniqueness of communication? Face-to-face, it can't be duplicated. It's very unique. And it's not permanent. It's transitory, whereas text, videos, those digital messages, they're permanent. So it's bad enough when you blurt something out face to face, when you're very emotional, but it's out, it's gone. And I think that's probably why some people prefer Snapchat, because Snapchat is time limited. It's an instant message, but it disappears after you viewed it. There was just a brief review of a study, and there were some photos that were posted via Snapchat, and 13% between 13 and 20% admitted using Snapchat to post things that were questionable, things they didn't want out there permanently, but they wanted to share. While some people may assume that this is a richer, more synchronous approach because it's a less permanent way of communication, and that they resemble face-to-face, you should realize that different situations and communicators call for different approaches. So be very careful with what you post. I'm sure you've heard this before. You want to be careful what you're posting. You don't want to embarrass yourself. Potential employers are out there. Sexting. Boy, we've heard a lot about that. So, and they're very private things. I'm not saying what's right or wrong in your own personal life. I'm just saying that you need to be competent in what you're posting. Think about what you're doing. Why do you want to put this message out there? Why do you want to communicate to the masses? Remember that mediated interpersonal communication is similar to mass personal communication, with the exception of, yes, it's personal in content, but mass communication goes to a larger audience. So mass personal communication goes to a larger audience. There's a lower obligation to respond by your audience. And there's a lower expectation of privacy because you're putting out to the masses. So you want to consider the boundaries that you have in place. So be careful of those impulsive messages or those posts that seem harmless at the time, but they may come to haunt you later in life. So I mentioned mass personal messages are aimed at large audiences. And you need to keep in mind what those boundaries are for yourself. What's your tone? You want to transmit messages without considering consequences? No, you don't want to practice disinhibition. Research shows that disinhibition is more likely in mediated channels than face-to-face. So you need to be careful when you're blasting off your opinions, blasting off a message through mediated communication. Take a step back and consider before you're engaging. That's part of competence in communication. How do you monitor yourself? Take a moment to scroll through your own messages and ask yourself, would I deliver the same message in person? Do you see messages where you've responded that aren't very clear? Take some time to review your level of competence. Let's consider the following video. What's the role of civility and disinhibition? Why do you believe that people don't consider the consequences of their flaming online?
I'd like to start a petition for a ban on all links to Julie DeCaro's Twitter feed.
Okay. Hi. Sarah. Hi. Sarah. Sarah. Nice to meet you, Dad.
All right, you ready to do some mean tweets?
I'm ready.
Sarah Spain sounds like a nagging wife on TV today.
Not even married yet.
Julie DeCaro is a run-of-the-mill, mediocre beat writer.
Not atrocious, not good.
Just sorta there.
I'm actually not a beat writer at all, but okay.
Sarah Spain is just a scrub muffin.
I don't even know what a scrub muffin
don't
is.
either.
I love muffins.
One of the players should beat you to death with their hockey stick, like the whore you are.
I'm just reading this.
Okay.
I mean... Okay, this is why we don't hire any females unless we need our sucked or our food cooked.
Sarah Spain is a self-important know-it-all. Okay. Just read
read the tweets, man. They're just mean tweets.
This dumb.
There's a lot of C word.
There's a lot of C
in-
words.
in here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope your dog gets hit by a car, you
Hopefully this skank Julie DeCaro is Bill Cosby's next victim. That would be classic.
I don't know what to say to that.
I don't... I don't think I can even say that.
I hope your boyfriend beats you. I'm sorry.
Why bring up your own rape in the story? Is it your way of firing back at critics who said you can't get any?
That's something, huh?
I'm sorry.
Okay. So I have to read all of them, right? Because, I mean,
Freedom, I guess.
I hope you get raped again.
Oh.
I'm having trouble looking at you when I'm saying these things. Sarah Spain is a I would hate. Okay.
You need to be hit in the head with a hockey puck and killed. That's it.
Sorry that these were directed toward you.
I'm sorry on behalf of other people everywhere that you've had to deal with this.
I feel like I need to apologize to my mother, but to be, that's a whole nother story.
Consider guidelines for civil use of social media. Did this video speak to you in some way? What is the role of leanness and disinhibition in communication? Your best chance of being heard will come from choosing the channels that are appropriate. You might get from people, why didn't you respond to my message? Some of us don't check our messages as often as others. Multimodality is the ability and willingness to use multiple channels of communication. Chan 2015. Communication practices among first-year college students found that respondents embrace this multimodality. They surveyed students that typically text with friends, phone their families, and use email when contacting their instructors. They said they would break up with a romantic partner in person rather than through digital media. And they prefer face-to-face over mediated communication. It's interesting to analyze the responses of this research. Adapt to the different channel preferences that are before you. Consider how you're sending your messages. We want to become competent, mediated communicators. We want to respect others. We want to respect the need of this undivided attention. We want to be mindful of bystanders. You might be considering when you're face to face, do you think about how others around you might feel? Well, think about that. Apply that when you're communicating through media. And balance your mediated and face time. Overuse of mediated communication can range from let me start that over. Overuse of mediated communication can range from slightly abnormal to borderline obsessive. Online gaming, for example, there's a lot of role playing, a lot of interaction. It can increase some relational satisfaction within the gamers, but if you have a partner, if you have a family, it can reduce that satisfaction. So overuse of any online communication to the extent that it excludes an individual can lead to negative outcomes or negative consequences. Pause for a moment, jot down some notes. How multimodal are you? Are you resistant? Do you just use one form of communicating through media? Remember that multimodality is the ability and willingness to use multiple channels of communication. Am I only using mediated? What are the channels that I'm using? And why do I only choose one? Competence in mediated communication helps the communicator understand your environment. You're going to be empathetic to the person you're engaging with. Are you that one that can't put your phone away? Why would people want to come together and divide attention? Stop and consider your own relationships. How are you communicating? Are you being competent in your mediated communication? Be honest with yourself. This chapter has helped us focus on how mediated interpersonal communication is valuable and how it can take away. The goal is to have both, have a multimodality, being able to use different means of communicating with others. Concluding mediated interpersonal communication from the 15th edition. We looked at what some of the benefits and drawbacks or the pros and cons of mediated communication, how you can distinguish between interpersonal and mass personal communication, and which is more appropriate given the circumstance, given the environment. Looking at that transactional model of communication, think about which channel is best to use. And how can you begin to apply principles to increase your competence with your mediated interpersonal and mass personal communication? Challenge yourself. Ask yourself these questions. Thank you for listening.